several years ago, I went on a journey. I'd been teaching in a school in a disadvantaged area in London, teaching science and psychology to the older students. And it became very clear within the first year of teaching that what I was able to do as a teacher, what I was able to change, was limited by the system that I was working in. And it got me very interested in education systems and how education systems and the policy sounds very dry, very, very important, can either support teachers or undermine teachers in their important work. So I decided to explore some education systems. And I had heard a lot about PISA. Everyone talks about PISA. And was very interested to see what was going on in those countries where many more students than in England were reaching much higher levels of literacy, traditional literacy, mathematical literacy, scientific literacy, and really importantly, there were many countries that were managing to get a greater proportion of their students to at least the basic levels that they needed to participate effectively in society compared to my own country. So I wanted to see what it was that they were doing. So I thought, well, I'd like to just go and have a look. There's only so much that you can learn from reading about these places. So I wrote to teachers in 6 high-performing education systems. I said, hello, I'm Lucy. I am a teacher from England. I would like to learn more about what's going on in your country. Please, can I come and help out? So I was offering to volunteer to help out in their schools. I can teach some English. I can teach some science. I can hear your children read. I can do your photocopying. Anything you like. Please, can I just come and hang out with you? Spend some time observing your lessons, talking to you in the staff room, learning from you. Oh, and can I stay with you too, please? And the reason for that was that truly, I couldn't have afforded to do such a trip if I was paying for hotels, but truly it was because I think teachers are the people, or the adults, who best understand what's going on in an education system, for better and for worse. And I wanted the teachers in each place to trust me so that they felt able to genuinely share with me their own reflections on the education system, which in some cultures, they'll tell you immediately what they think and all the problems when they first meet you. In other cultures, it takes a little bit more time for political and social reasons. Remarkably, teachers in all of these countries said yes. So I was able to spend time in Finland, Japan, Shanghai, Singapore, Canada, and New Zealand. I spent about a month to 6 weeks in each place, teaching everywhere I went. Oh, I need my clicker. I want to show you a picture. So this is me teaching in China. So I taught everywhere I went, more so in countries that were not English-speaking, because I was more useful to them. And I observed lessons, interviewed everyone, head teachers, policymakers, teachers, parents, students, taxi drivers, anyone that would talk to me about their own perceptions of education in that country. Now, what I'm going to share with you today is focused, because obviously education's an enormous topic. I'm going to focus in on curriculum, because I understand that you have a new curriculum that's been designed and that's being piloted at the moment. I've had a brief look at it. I've not done a full curriculum analysis, but just to inform my talk today. So there's 2 particular things I would like to share with you about curriculum in high-performing education systems. There are 2 features that I'm going to talk about today, and they are focus and coherence. So curricula in high-performing education systems do these 2 things. And this is not just based on my observations and conversations, but on a giant analysis by Bill Schmidt and colleagues, some American researchers, who analyzed over 40 curricula, and they were looking to see, are there any features that curricula in high-performing countries have that lower-performing countries don't have? So trying to identify, is there something about the curriculum that is helping that these countries get so many more of their students to perform highly in reading, in maths, and in science? And I'm going to start with a quote from one of the students I met on my travels. So this quote is from a girl called Sophie. Sophie's Chinese. She spent 15 years of her life being educated in China, and she then moved to Canada, which is where I met her. All of the Chinese students I met chose to be known by their Western names. So she was Chinese, her name she'd chosen herself was Sophie. And she was comparing the two education systems from the perspective of a student. So I asked her, what was the biggest difference? I wasn't asking her about curriculum specifically, the biggest educational difference that you noticed between these two countries. And it's worth noting, just for the purposes of this quote, that although Canada is a high performer for the West, it's nowhere near as high performing as the Chinese regions that participate in PISA, especially in maths and science, which was her focus here. So Sophie said, the most significant difference I find is the depth of material covered. In Canada, they do a little bit of everything, and they do it really fast before you really get the essence of that part, and then they jump into something else. Whereas in China, they go on about some knowledge for quite a long time, maybe several weeks, before they move to the next topic. So you get a lot of practice, and you really know it. So this feature of curriculum that Sophie was experiencing herself as a student is known as focus, and it's one of the features which Schmidt and colleagues identified as being so important in high-performing systems. In other words, there are fewer topics taught each year in top-performing countries compared to lower-performing countries. And just as a nice visual illustration, this is from Schmidt and colleagues, there's two piles of textbooks here. One is American textbooks, and one is Japanese textbooks. This is maths, 8th grade. And you can see Japan is a high performer in PISA consistently, especially in mathematics. And you can see how much smaller, how much thinner those textbooks are in Japan compared to the textbooks in America. 10 topics in 8th grade rather than an average of 30. Now, you might think, oh, well, does that mean that American students end up doing much more advanced mathematics? No, it doesn't. Because what's happening in lower performing countries that have many more topics per year is that there's not the time in each year for students to really grasp what it is that they're supposed to be learning. And so you end up teaching it again the next year. And then actually you end up teaching it again the following year too. So rather than revisiting and then deepening or advancing that learning, you're just teaching the same thing again and again because the students didn't have time to understand it the first time, or at least many of the students didn't have that time. And this relates to a feature that's pedagogical as well as curricular, which is called a mastery approach to education, which is very common in Singapore, especially in Shanghai. And actually, this is one of those pedagogies that has traveled, and it's now very much used in English schools too. So a mastery approach is where you have the vast majority of pupils are progressing through the curriculum at the same pace. So it's a whole class model in the sense that, right, this is our grade 8 class. We together are going to learn this year, and we're all going to make sure we have time for all of you to understand it, and then together we will discuss it and use it, and then we will move on to the next thing, rather than, oh, I'm doing one thing at my little desk, and someone else is doing their thing at their little desk, and actually we can't really talk about it because we're doing completely different things. You might see there's a slightly different flavor coming out here from Andreas Schleicher's talk just now. But this is what's happening in places like Singapore, Shanghai, Finland, or at least before they started declining in PISA. You ask me about it later. So the vast majority of pupils are progressing through the curriculum at the same pace. But crucially, this mastery approach is that you don't move on. As a teacher, you don't move on to the next topic because, oh, we've spent 2 weeks on this now, we need to move on. You wait until all the students have really understood the important ideas that you want them to understand, or all the students have developed the really important skills you want them to develop, and then you move on. So you don't leave anyone behind. So what that means, and you can see how this relies on this focus in the curriculum. It relies on not having too much content to get through, not too much content to cover. And it means that academically weaker pupils are supported to reach at least the standard they need to progress. In other words, they understand at least what they need so that when they come to revisit this topic in grade 9, they understand what's going on because they understood this thing in year 7. And then the more able pupils are encouraged to explore that content in greater depth. So it's those students who then go on much, much deeper into that material and do extension activities and really explore it. And often that's self-directed exploration of that particular area. So children are less likely to be left behind. When you have too much content, children end up being left behind. Having a focus also leaves space for the development of 21st century skills, Because if you have too much content and you're focusing on, right, let's learn this, let's learn this, let's learn this, where is the time to use it? Where is the time to be creative with it? Where is the time to really develop your critical thinking, to make connections between different subjects? This is all such important stuff, and we all know this. We know it's really important. You've got in your curriculum, you recognize that it's really important. But where is the time? Where is the time to do it? This is, in fact, it was in Mr. Schleicher's slides just now. The main barrier that teachers are reporting to introducing more creativity into schools was an overcrowded curriculum. If you want to have a creative curriculum, if you want to have time for students to develop their creativity, you need to reduce the amount of content that you are trying to cover. It is still very important that children have knowledge. You cannot be creative if you don't know anything. You cannot think critically about a subject if you don't know anything about it. So the fact that your teachers feel confident in delivering pedagogy in their subjects is a real strength. We don't want to lose that. But there needs to be time to take it that step further and then actually use what the children are learning. So that was focus, so focusing on fewer topics, clearly specified, allowing for greater depth of study and space for application. The second thing is coherence. So coherence is slightly more of a complicated concept to describe. So bear with me, because I'm going to share the official definition. And even just to reassure you, as a native English speaker, I don't really, it takes a long time to kind of oh, what does that mean? So here it is. You read that. I'm going to have a drink of water. So, in other words, I'm going to translate this for you. What does this mean if a curriculum is coherent? It means that in your curriculum, the knowledge and the skills in your curriculum are carefully sequenced so that at every stage in a curriculum that a student gets to, students have already been taught, and ideally have, the necessary understanding or ability that they need to access that new learning. So you don't just introduce something and think, oh, well, now they're going to learn this thing. You think, if they're going to learn this thing, what is the learning that they need to already have to access this new learning? So for example, it's quite obvious in something like mathematics. Children need to understand what fractions are before they can really understand how to add fractions. At least if they're going to have any kind of depth of understanding versus just learning the procedures. But it also applies across different subjects. It applies in the humanities as well. So, for example, rather than going straight into teaching students about the workings of the National Council in Slovakia, that's quite complex. So in order to understand that, children might need to have an introduction to a simpler context in which to understand democracy, such as the ancient Greeks, one man per vote, so that they can think, oh yes, now I've heard of this democracy thing, and I understood that in its simple form. Now I'm ready to learn about this slightly more complex manifestation of democracy. And why is it so important? So, to some extent, it's intuitively important, isn't it? When we think about it, we think, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. But this is also backed up by cognitive science. Because according to cognitive science, children and us and adults, we all learn by connecting new learning with something that we already know. And we can't really learn if we don't do that. We forget it or we don't understand it. So if you don't have existing knowledge or experiences to connect new learning to, children are less likely to understand it and they're less likely to remember it. And we know this as teachers. When we're teaching, you're trying to grasp, but how can I link this into their daily lives, something that everyone will already know? So I'm thinking, okay, I'm trying to teach them about melting. And I'm saying to the students, oh, have you noticed that when if you squeeze an ice cube, it starts to melt a bit? But you're really grasping at straws. You're like, oh, how can I link this to something that they know? If you have a coherent curriculum, sure, it's still nice to do that. But you don't have to, because you know that, well, I can link this into what they learned in grade 6. And I know they learned this in grade 6 because there's a coherent and clear curriculum. So I can say, okay, do you remember when in grade 6 you were learning about melting? Tell me what you remember. Great. Now we're going to learn about what's actually happening inside that ice cube and why is it melting. So you remind the students about the previous thing, and then you link in the new learning. And at the moment in your curriculum, as I said, I've not done a proper analysis, but just some kind of I'm going to offer some suggestions with humility and recognition that I don't understand your context. You have in stage 3, in the history section, one of the topics is a period of revolutions and reforms, which contains quite a lot of difficult concepts. Quite a lot of concepts that I would argue, again, I don't understand your context, perhaps Slovakian adults are all highly politically literate, but in England, most adults would not understand what was meant by the nation state, imperialism, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, etc. So this is quite hard. And that's not to say that's a problem, but if students are coming to this, and this is the first time that they have studied any political history, and they're going straight in at constitutional monarchy and absolutist monarchy, you're probably going to lose half your students. Sure, they'll be in the classroom, they'll hear it, but they won't understand it and they won't remember it. What you can do to support students, if you think these are really important ideas for all students to understand, how you can support students to actually grasp them, is to make sure that previously in your curriculum, so in the second cycle, for example, stage 2, you could introduce a topic that has some more simple political history. For example, introducing ideas like monarchy, so that when they come to understanding the difference between constitutional and absolutist monarchy, it's not such a big jump. And then you could track that back even further. So in stage 2, you're introducing monarchy. In stage 1, well, then you could be making sure that students are learning about kings and queens. Something that, I have a 5-year-old. They love kings and queens. So I'm going to finish by sharing an example from Singapore of what this focus and this coherence looks like. This is a snapshot of the Singaporean primary science curriculum on one page. There is slightly more to it I'm going to show you in a moment, but this is an overview. So the first thing I want you to notice about this is that the same themes run down the side here. The same themes are returned to in different phases. So in lower primary school, they start by studying the interaction of forces. Children are introduced to the idea of force and they're studying magnets. They're very deliberately then coming back to similar ideas. They're reminding the students, what do you remember about forces? Where have you heard about forces before? And about the interactions. And then they're teaching them about new interactions, frictional force, gravitational force. Now, it's not on the screen, but this extends into lower primary, into lower secondary as well. So the equivalent of your stages 1, 2, and 3, they are tracking the same domains, the same general areas all the way through, so that they are deliberately and gradually building up students' understanding in each of these areas. I also want you to notice the focus here. This is the whole of the primary science curriculum. If you kind of add them up in terms of each bullet point, where a plant system is one topic, a human system is another, this is spread over 4 years. So there are about 4 or 5 topics each year. So far, similar to your new curriculum. But what sits underneath each of these things is quite light. So within each of these topics, so let's zoom in here on the diversity of living and non-living things and see what does the Singaporean curriculum have to say about that. That's it. So it's not a lot. And actually, if you have a look at these headings, you've got, this is all the knowledge. 2 bullet points. That's all the knowledge, the most important knowledge that children need. But because there's not that much in there, all of the children are really going to understand these 2 things properly. And the children are going to not only understand these 2 things and know them, they're going to apply them. They're going to use these skills of observation and classifying, and they're actually going to use that knowledge to do something with it. And what's also very clever about the Singaporean curriculum is they deliberately link in the broader competencies and the ethics and the attitudes to specific topics. So you can see they've also got ethics and attitudes where they have identified, well, what are the attitudes that we can quite sensibly link in to this particular content. So it's focused. They've identified what are the most important things that we want for all students. And it's hard to make these decisions because there will be important things that they've left out. But these are the most important things. And this is your new curriculum. So I've taken one topic from your new curriculum in primary science at the same level. or substances. Some of them aren't as big as this, some of them are smaller. But there appears to be, just based on my initial analysis, there appears to be more content in your new curriculum. So you've got all of this as the knowledge, which is appropriate in terms of its specificity. It's really important that the important knowledge is listed, and I think that it's an appropriate level. But there is quite a lot there, including the activities, and then you also have outcomes that teachers are trying to meet as well, in addition to everything else in the curriculum. So my message to you would be to pay careful attention to the results of your pilot. When you have the results come back from the schools that are piloting this new curriculum, really make sure you take seriously what the teachers say about whether they feel that they had time to not just cover everything, but make sure that all the students, or let's make this slightly more real world, almost all the students actually understood everything in there, could use it, and that they also then still had time to develop the 21st century skills. Because what I've failed to point out just now as well, which you might have noticed, is this: white space. So part of the reason that Singapore have had such a focused curriculum is because they recognize the need for a bit of white space in the curriculum, which is time for the teachers to either, they might choose to revisit something that the students hadn't understood, they might choose to do something completely innovative and completely different based on their own passions, based on what the students are interested in, but that's where the magic happens. And if you have too much content in your curriculum, teachers don't have the opportunity to do that. Students don't have the opportunity to benefit from that. So, features of high-performing curricula: be focused, be coherent, don't forget about the white space. Thank you.